Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be taking a look at Putin's Playbook by Rebekah Koffler, doing a little bit of a book review where we will kind of give a brief overview of some of the main points and then go into our ratings. Now, I chose this book to read. Obviously, it's about Putin, but for a couple reasons. First, I think Rebekah Koffler's background is very interesting and relevant to looking at kind of the issue of Putin/Russia in contemporary times, in that she worked for the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, as a intelligence operative, specifically in the sphere of Russia, and she grew up in the Soviet Union. And so this gives her kind of the mastery of both the Russian language as well as the background of, hearing the loud car outside, gives her a little bit of insights into kind of Putin's way of thinking, or Russian ways of thinking. And then secondarily, this book is coming from a very conservative type of slant. It is published by the Regenery Gateway, which is a publisher that is kind of doing a lot of mainstreamish conservative types of books. To some extent, a lot of the mainstreamish conservative talking points of the book feel a little ad hoc added in terms of the prose, and it does look like some stuff was added in, but also the back of the book has an endorsement by Newt Gingrich. And like the inside flap, it starts with the Russian collusion hoax not only poisoned American politics and sowed confusion about the real Russian threat about the United States. I find her analysis on that specifically interesting. I still think that there was definitely... She contradicts herself in the opening chapter in regards to collusion, in that she argues that Putin doesn't have a preference for Trump, but then does. But her analysis is a little bit interesting in that even if there was no collusion, the narrative of there being a collusion helps out Russia because it divides America. And it divides Americans because half of the country sees the president as illegitimate, and the other half thinks that the other is being conspiratorial. And she references the Mueller report saying that there was no collusion. And so while I think there was malfeasance, you could argue that there's no collusion, this type of thing. But it is a little bit interesting that, in my opinion, the narrative that even if there was no collusion, propagating this narrative is something that would definitely interest Putin. But wanted to read something from a more conservative slant, and so we got into it. Now, there's kind of a few main themes that she kind of talks about multiple times to some extent, and she's a little bit repetitive, and then she's kind of a little bit patting her own back in regards to her work at the DIA in a lot of the prose. So I don't necessarily think it's the best written book, but she's also an intelligence operative, not an author, proper, and so, to some extent you could forgive her for not necessarily writing the best book. But the first kind of most important point is that we are effectively already fighting a sort of soft war with Russia. Russia repeatedly hacks critical infrastructure, not only getting mapping of that critical infrastructure, but also working on gaining the ability to gain access, and also ability to shut down critical infrastructure like the energy grid, water, power. She goes into like long lists of compromised, kind of infrastructure in various spheres. And I thought that this was quite a bit interesting. But not only that, there's also an information campaign to divide Americans as much as possible. And I think that this has been quite successful over the past 10 years, in part because social media in general tends to, it has a bias towards sensationalism and outrage in general. And those are the things that in particular are not only effective for increasing engagement, which is what the social media companies care about because of advertisement. She doesn't really talk about this analysis, but this is also the type of thing that gets gets one side to hate the other, and to hold up I think conservatives and liberals in the United States specifically, this is a pretty problematic type of thought pattern. They have an idea of what the other one is, that is this gross generalization that is based on extremes, and then they judge all the others based on this generalization. And so to that extent, the soft type of campaign that Russia is waging has been effective. She does talk a lot about spycraft in particular. I won't necessarily unpack it. Stuff like like Russians infiltrating over the course of like multiple decades via families and this type of stuff, like really, really committal or high resource types of actions that are taken out by or that are taken by the FSB, which is the modern KGB or the reorganized version of the KGB. And so this is very interesting. The second thing she talks about is she talks about what a kinetic war with Russia would look like. And there's kind of two fronts that are particularly important. There is the front by which you analyze America's strengths, which is largely based on information and having really, really a high-grade technology and precision and this type of thing. In particular, a lot of this is really reliant on satellites. And something that Russia has been developing is the ability to take out satellites in the event that it, ends up fighting a kinetic war with the U.S. But also, she talks a little bit about nukes, and an interesting sort of analysis, which is a part of Russian doctrine is to escalate in order to de-escalate. And so to deploy nuclear weapons in order to de-escalate. And the idea being is one that is informed by Russian sort of culture, which is another point that she talks about kind of extensively. The big point is that Russia has a way bigger tolerance for loss of life. And so when you have the deployment of nukes, the Russian people, or when you have nuclear exchange on a tactical level, not strategic nukes, but nukes here and there, on the battlefield specifically, the West has a way less of a stomach for it than Russia does. And so the idea is that the people strongly disapproved enough to the extent that this can force America out of conflicts that are kinetic in nature, while Russia continues to undermine, American interests and America via its sort of soft interventions that are not kinetic in nature, but the hacking and the undermining, sowing discord and chaos and this type of thing. She also, in terms of the culture, makes a little bit of an argument that is interesting, which is that Russia, for the past 1,000 years, half of that they've been under attack from some other nation, and makes this sort of historical type of argument, which it kind of has a little bit of the conclusion that, or she makes this argument that Russia feels like the West is out to get them, and in particular, any sort of olive branch is just a means by which they can dupe the Russians and this type of thing. And so they feel that they're fighting a war that is defensive in nature, protecting specifically their sphere of influence. They believe that they deserve control over all of Eurasia. And she spends quite a bit of time talking about that type of stuff in particular. But this is also an important point, because all throughout she makes the point that one of the reasons that the United States is very ineffective at fighting Russia, and Russia is very effective at fighting the United States, is that Russia understands Americans better than Americans understand Russians, which is an interesting sort of argument. Throughout, she doesn't really have much condemnation of Putin, and also has a little bit of a tone of admiration for him. And in terms of thinking of the kind of contemporary conflict, she seems to be of the opinion that we shouldn't intervene or assist Ukraine. But this is kind of, she doesn't really talk about that very much, except to talk about it from the extent of Russia caring about their sphere of influence and intervening in nearby satellite nations and this type of stuff. She uses Ukraine as an example rather than a topic, But this was also written in 2020, and there is one little part where she writes, I predict sometime in the next 3 years or something that Russia will attack Ukraine again, which is, prophetic, because Russia attacked Ukraine again. And so this was a bit interesting, but let's get into the ratings. And one of the reasons I kind of scored low on the ratings is because in a lot of spots is because of she repeats herself in terms of her points quite a lot. And this makes, to the extent that you could get utility out of this book, if you have to read the same thing multiple times, it's not necessarily that useful. And she also does a lot of back padding for herself, I kind of felt like, where she's talking about stuff that really just has a lot more to do with her career and this type of thing, and it's all self-congratulatory rather than forming any kind of narrative or really driving home a particular point as it relates to Putin, and it just seems kind of unnecessary. I wonder if she was trying to hit a particular page count for this, and also to some extent a lot of the stuff that's more political in nature, the prose reads a little bit different. So I think that it's possible she wrote the book and then couldn't get it published, and then found a publisher that would pick her up, like a very conservative one, and they wanted her to put in these talking points, and she said, okay. Something like this. So one of the reasons getting into utility, I scored it a little bit low, was I think that to the extent that it is important to understand like what's going on vis-a-vis like understanding that Russia is an enemy of the West, this book is useful, but it's kind of a little bit repetitive and would not be one that I would highly recommend. For novelty, I found it a bit interesting. I think if you don't understand that Russia's intervening, specifically in terms of driving Americans away from each other as part of their campaign to undermine America, that this is kind of something that's pretty important to know. And while I think you can find this information in a lot of different places, I think if you don't have it, and you're part of the West, that this is a little bit of a miss, because it's not just America that is target of these campaigns, but kind of all of the Western nations, or any that Russia views as a threat specifically. For entertainment, I gave it a 3. I wasn't particularly engrossed while reading this. Some of the stuff was a little bit interesting, especially with the stuff on the satellites and like this type of stuff, and how the United States has like really big and expensive satellites, and this specifically is vulnerable against ground to satellite kind of interventions relative to having a more redundant, cheaper satellites that you have much more of, in order to have redundancies, would be a lot more resilient towards kind of space-oriented weapons. So really kind of the space stuff was not information that I'd seen before and was a bit interesting to read. I didn't really contribute that to novelty because I don't think that's important to know, but it was entertaining to read that. For style, I gave her a 2. She's both. I felt that she repeated herself a whole ton, in ways that weren't really that constructive, and like it to some extent, it felt like I was like, okay, I've already read this, and it comes up several times, and then also, in particular, she seemed very self-congratulatory and like. Either she was the best, and she like also just whinges a lot about apparatchiks, as it were, which is kind of the Soviet word for bureaucrat, because she got fired from the DIA, and so, which she argues is unjustly. I can't possibly pass judgment on this type of thing. By the sounds of it, it was unjustly, but she's obviously the one kind of giving that information, but she also like makes it sound like she was the best employee ever. And it's just like, it's self-congratulatory in a way that just doesn't fit the theme of the book, in my opinion. Because the book is like supposed to be like less about her, or like the book is branded as like Putin's Playbook, right? And I don't think that she's like establishing credentials or knowledge or narrative in a lot of her stuff where she talks about herself. And so I really was not a huge fan of the style. For readability, I gave it a 4. Maybe this is a little bit unfair. It certainly wasn't very hard to read, but I think that to some extent, ability to communicate information concisely and clearly is something that underpins readability. And I think that she fails to do it concisely, so we should kind of ding her a little bit. And then for interest, I gave it a 5. I do think the book's a bit interesting. I think that perspective is a bit interesting. Really wouldn't be the first book I would recommend on Putin and Russia. This is like the 4th or 5th book we've read on the topic. And so it wouldn't, I wouldn't rank it highly, but it is a bit interesting. Also, I think that it's possible, if I were to recommend books specifically to conservatives, that they would be more receptive towards. Maybe this would be actually a spectacular book on that kind of ground. I'm not a conservative, and so to some extent, I'm probably not giving her as fair a shake I would if I were a conservative. Also, in her defense, she's not a like career author, right? She's an intelligence agent, and so she's going to be worse at the whole writing shtick rather than the intelligence gathering stuff. And so we did give it a 5. It was a bit interesting for an overall score of 3.58, which is relatively low. I think it maybe doesn't deserve this bad a score, but this was the overall average score that we achieved. So maybe we're a little bit biased. I mean, some of the stuff she was writing was, I thought, kind of like silly and like kind of partisan hackery. She also worked for Michael Flynn and just like super defends Michael Flynn and this type of stuff. So to the extent that that's like stuff that you care about, this type of thing, I really did find some of the analysis that like, or the analysis specifically that even if there was no Russia collusion, still spreading misinformation that there was collusion is something that benefits Putin because it divides America. I thought that analysis was very interesting, even though I'm inclined to think that Putin was intentionally putting his thumb on the scale for Trump, even if there wasn't collusion, because he would have preferred him as a candidate. But which she kind of contradicts herself on whether or not she thinks that. Largely the point, though, for releasing the Hillary documents, she argues, was not necessarily trying to make Trump win, but to undermine Hillary when she gets in office, this type of thing, as it relates to the 2016 election in the United States. But we also do have the splashed quote, Russian doctrine envisions infliction of civilian casualties as a way of de-escalating conflict because the Westerners cannot stand seeing the imagery of human suffering on CNN. I think that this perspective is a little bit interesting, specifically, and I think a lot of people are under the impression that the United States would just win very easily against Russia in a war, and after reading this, call an ambulance, but not for Russia, right? Because the impression I got was there are rather a lot of really strong points that the United States would be in a little bit of trouble on this front, when it comes to dealing with Russia, and is already very troubled on the front of Americans kind of hate each other. And this is part of the information campaign, and that has been remarkably successful. But as far as recommendations go, I generally wouldn't recommend this book too strongly, except for someone who I thought was like really conservative, and I thought that they would be more receptive to Putin, problematizing Putin through the lens of, patting on the back Trump quite a bit, which does happen in this kind of book. And so something like this, but I wouldn't recommend it necessarily too highly. And I think that a lot of the main points or the important points can be summarized very, very quickly. And so it takes like 300 pages to get the point across. And so because she's repetitive and she talks about herself quite a bit in a way that's not necessarily that germane to like the point she's trying to make. And so generally wouldn't recommend the book except to... I also wouldn't recommend the book because I think the U.S. involvement in Ukraine is like important, and she kind of is of the opinion that it doesn't help U.S. security, this type of thing, and she might be, she could be right, but I don't think that she is, and so even for conservatives, I'd be less likely to recommend this in particular. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube algorithm thing, and other than that, have a good one.